Great to see new faces here in the room as well as online. Welcome, and I'm Mutturaj Swami, Director of CCCW. If you are not on our mailing list, please sign up on the sheet on the drinks table before you leave. And those online, please feel free to email us. We will get in touch with you. Also, as already Paulina said, today's presentation will be recorded and will be available on the CCCW YouTube channel. Today, it is a pleasure to have with us Dr. Daryl Ireland, Associate Director of the Center for Global Christianity and Mission at Boston University. It really is a privilege for me to welcome him and introduce him. During the last few days, we have been having some wonderful conversations. Today, Daryl will speak on the topic Chinese Christianity, why posters can change our understanding of the Chinese Christian past. Daryl is the author of several works on Christianity in Asia and its interaction with international development and faith. His work covers revitalization movements, women in revivalism, and religious conversion. His most recent book is here, Visions of Salvation, Chinese Christian Posters in an Age of Revolution. Edited by him and published by the Baylor University Press just this year. So congrats, Daryl. The book looks at how theology is primarily expressed by posters in ordinary and the everyday lives of Christians in China, which is going to be the topic today. Daryl is also the author of the book John Song, Modern Chinese Christianity and the Making of a New Man. 2020, also by Baylor University Press. And the book explores the evolution of Chinese revivalist spirituality into the dominant form of Chinese Christianity. Daryl leads the Chinese Christian Posters Project, digitizing and sharing 700 Christian posters from China's Republican era, and we are going to see some today. Also, he co-directs the China Historical Christian Database, documenting Christianity in China from 1550 to 1950. So we are delighted to have you with us today, Daryl, and also Daryl is accompanied by Dr. Cisco Ireland, his wife, who is accompanying him this visit to Cambridge, and welcome you, Cisco. And Daryl, over to you.
Good afternoon. It is a pleasure to be here with you, both online and for those who are here in person. I am delighted to have this opportunity to share with you the discovery of long forgotten Chinese Christian posters and invite you to look at them deeply and begin to see how these posters can begin to change the way we think about Christianity in the first half of the 20th century in China. But before I get to that, I want to take a moment to acknowledge and thank the Cambridge Center for Christianity Worldwide, the Divinity School faculty, for organizing this time. I particularly want to thank Mutturaj Swami and his team for all the details that have gone in the work putting this together. It's a real privilege, and I thank you for the effort you've made to make today happen. So thank you very much. And thank you all for being here. Your presence, both physically and online, makes this a much richer conversation that we will have, I believe, at the end. No. Let me try. Okay, that will work. When the communists swept to power in 1949, they swept away their rivals, and that included erasing the most public dimension of Christianity in the country, Chinese Christian posters. These have been printed by the millions and hung up on city walls and temple gates. They had been pasted in tea rooms and unfolded for street evangelism. These posters were everywhere until they completely disappeared and were forgotten. Until one afternoon, after speaking about Christianity in China, a woman approached me very directly and came right up and said, "I need your help." And she gave me a little backstory. Her grandfather, Earl Ireton, had been in China during World War II. He had survived the war, had returned to the United States, and on his way home, his train had derailed and he died. He never made it back from the war, only his trunk. And the grieving widow received this, put it up in her attic, and told her daughter, and then later her grandchildren, not to touch it. But the grandmother had recently died, and when they opened the trunk, they discovered what they described as Chinese Christian posters. Could I help them? Now, as she described this to me, my memory was jogged that maybe I had seen something like this in an archive, a photo, or maybe a missionary periodical, but they had never stood out to me until this family brought the physical posters to the Center for Global Christianity and Mission and allowed me to see them. And they are almost unbelievable. I'm glad the book is circulating, so you can see the vibrancy of the colors in these posters and their sheer size. I mean, they're over 1 meter long and almost half a meter wide. They're really quite extraordinary. And I was thrilled when Earl Ireton's family decided to donate their collection of 10 posters to Boston University. And I honestly thought at that time we had the world's largest collection of these posters because I had never seen them in an archive before. It was my more sober wife, Dr. Ireland Verwoerd, who took the time to get online, play around a while, and said, well, maybe you should talk to SOAS. They might have some posters, and maybe Yale University has some posters. And so I began writing letters that has now been going on for about 7 years, and we have worked with many institutions around the world to digitize Chinese Christian posters. And we've managed to put them on a website and make them freely accessible at ccposters.com. And today we have almost 800 different posters now online. So I encourage you to take a look. Putting all those posters together provides us a new mosaic in which we can see the past. This project around posters confirms at least one thing: archives are dangerous places. They can upend our expectations and our perceptions of the past and remind us that the so-called winners, in this case the communists, cannot always rewrite the history. Because, as the second president of the United States, John Adams, famously quipped, facts are stubborn things. And these posters are stubborn things. They may have been suppressed for a while, but now that they have resurfaced, they are telling a different story. This afternoon, I'm going to share with you 5 forgotten stories, and they're all unpacked at greater length in this book, but let me give you 5 teasers. Instead of one in-depth lecture on a single aspect of these posters, I hope that you will walk away with one in-depth impression. These posters just might rewrite the history of Chinese Christianity in the first half of the 20th century. Let me try to explain why. In 1926, the Chinese nationalists and communists briefly teamed up to defeat regional warlords and recreate one central ruling power in China. As that army marched north behind a phalanx of pamphleteers, the General Secretary of the Religious Tract Society watched in a mixture of admiration and frustration. They are using our means and improving upon them. he lamented. Why can't Christians be so creative with their own tracts and posters to win the heart of China's millions? He issued a general plea to all believers in China, quote, do propaganda work for your Lord and Master. In 1927, just a few months later, the National Christian Council of China answered the call and sent out posters to the roughly 1/3 of all Protestant churches in China under its umbrella. Arriving in stacks of 100, these were not posters that were to be put up in sanctuaries or discussed in Sunday school classrooms. The bottom of the poster says it very clearly, please hang in a public space. You can see that Christians were co-opting the nationalist and eventually later, too far back, they anticipated that communist imagery, but now making Jesus the true revolutionary. He was the one creating, as it says on the poster, a new China. But this is not supposed to be happening. Scholars have recognized that Christians were early on very politically active in China. In fact, in its first national election in 1922, 22% of the people elected to the legislature were Christian, despite being less than 1% of the population. However, by 1922, just a decade later, China was in the grips of a massive anti-Christian backlash, the anti-Christian movement, and Christians were besieged and began to withdraw from public activism to a more personal and private piety, at least according to popular wisdom and scholarship. And by 1927, so the argument goes, the nationalists and the communists, as they teamed up, combined their political power and finally choked out any remnants of Christian political aspiration. But of course, these posters obviously tell us otherwise. Christians had an answer to the most debated political question of the time. How were the Chinese people to 救国? How were they to save the nation? Turn to Christ. And this was not just accept Jesus privately into your heart. Jesus was to play a more public role in the transformation of the nation. Think about this. Chinese politicians were somewhat in a panic after the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911. Without it, what was going to hold China's different ethnic groups together? If they couldn't unite, then foreign powers were going to just pull China apart. Sun Yat-sen pleaded with his fellow citizens to come together, and he tried to symbolize the new political order with a new symbol. 5 colors for the new national flag to represent the 5 ethnic groups in China, all in one flag. Now look at this poster. And don't be deceived, it's not a sentimental children's poster. It was explicitly made for adults. And the message is clear. Jesus is the one who holds China's 5 ethnic groups within his embrace. Furthermore, according to the political language of the time, as the only adult in the poster, it is Jesus's responsibility to tutor the nation and raise it to political maturity. No doubt, many viewers balked at these very brazen Christian political claims. But we can no longer pretend that Christians weren't making them. They had a Christian vision for national salvation, a politics for countrywide transformation. Now, granted, the embracing arms of Jesus are a weak recipe for nation building, but they are hardly less vacuous than the nationalist or communist propaganda of the time. propaganda posters are not the place for advancing specific political policies, but for offering aspirational visions. And at that level, Christians could and did compete with the political parties of the day. Although Christian political action in this time period has been forgotten, downplayed, or denied, it turns out in the first half of the 20th century, Christians were boldly political and offered their fellow citizens an alternative way to national salvation. If you know nothing else about fundamentalists and modernists in the first half of the 20th century, perhaps we can agree on this. They didn't like each other. They wrote all kinds of nasty things about one another. Fundamentalists called modernists apostates who had been duped by Satan. Modernists, meanwhile, despised fundamentalists and called them moss-backed, fossil-like, and narrow-minded. The rift in China was so deep that the two groups developed separate institutions, separate journals, even separate summer retreats. Everything was separated. They found no common ground between them. At least, that is what we've always assumed, based on the written record. But if the visual record tells us a completely different story. In fact, it's shocking to realize that if we only had posters and not the published sermons, books, and articles that we've relied on for the last century, we would have assumed that fundamentalism and modernism had never reached China's shores. Because the fact is, visually speaking, the two were virtually identical. I've already referenced, of course, the Protestant political vision. Both fundamentalists and modernists agreed that Christianization was the pathway to China's national salvation. But the crossover continues elsewhere. I'm going to give you just two more examples. First, fundamentalists and modernists both saw deep corruption in China's new economic order. Cities in particular were inventing new class structures that never existed in the countryside. The bourgeoisie, for example, emerged as a new and powerful force that controlled the means of production. And of course, the communists protested their wealth and power. But by the 1930s, the nationalist government in China had driven those radicals into small Soviets in rural China. That left it to Christians to speak to the gross inequalities that were surfacing, especially since the nationalists hitched themselves to a bourgeois plan for modernization. In that context, Protestants of all stripes condemned the unequal distribution of wealth categorically. Every single time money appeared in a poster, it is with a negative connotation. I particularly love this poster. Produced by the very conservative Religious Tract Society, you get a picture of China's new urban elite, a cosmopolitan man who has turned his global awareness and connections into lucrative gain. But what I find most interesting is this right here. The lenses of his glasses are coins. What better way to say that everywhere the bourgeoisie look, they only see money. Everything is commodified in their eyes. The water, the land, their families, everything is there to be exploited. The texts on the poster make it clear. Anyone this blinded by money is doomed. Meanwhile, the modernists were also protesting the wealth disparities that were emerging in China's cities. Look at this poster. It challenges the man reclining in his chair to get up and make things right. His comfort and leisure are purchased unjustly, he is lounging on the shoulders of exhausted laborers. Or to approach the matter from another perspective, this YWCA poster highlights the harsh conditions of the working class. They had to spend 56% of their money on food alone. That's a recipe for endless insecurity. So despite what you might think, time and again, fundamentalists and modernists converged in protest over social issues, like the gross inequalities in China's modern economy. But it didn't end there. Fundamentalists and modernists in China presented the Bible in the same terms. Now that's shocking, really, because the Bible is exactly what they were fighting over. Fundamentalists insisted that the Bible was the one and only ultimate authority. It's God's word. To sift God's word through a sieve of biology, geology, or physics to see what was really true was to create an idol. Modernists, they charged, worshiped a God diminished by their own reason and science, rather than the God revealed in the Bible. Now, the flashpoints in this debate were predictable. They fought over the deity of Christ, the virgin birth, miracles, the resurrection. Look, wherever the supernatural appeared in the biblical text, there the fundamentalists would gather. You would think, therefore, that fundamentalist posters would emphasize the Bible's stories of the miraculous, but they didn't. In fact, both fundamentalists and modernists created very few posters about the Bible, and when they did, they overwhelmingly preferred the parables in the Bible. A comparison with Roman Catholic posters is useful here. I've tracked down 67 Catholic posters based on New Testament stories. Only 6 of those 67 illustrate a parable. The others all focus on the birth, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Whereas the Protestant posters, their emphases are completely inverted. 16 capture a story about Jesus, while 56 posters showcase one of the stories told by Jesus. Significantly, parables do not feature supernatural elements. Jesus' stories relish in everyday images like yeast being worked into dough or a gardener trying to make a tree grow. The Protestant proclivity for parables made debates about God violating scientific laws irrelevant because miracles were absent. Even when Protestants dared to depict a scene from the life of Jesus, both modernists and fundamentalists minimized the miraculous. Take the virgin birth, for example. This was a point of intense debate among Protestants, but only Catholics disturbed the scene with supernatural actors. The conservative religious tract society is naturalism. By contrast, may be their poster's most defining feature. And the more liberal Anglican Church in China's publishing house only alludes to unusual events by making one star slightly larger than the others. Fundamentalists and modernists both downplayed the life of Jesus with its high concentration of miracles in favor of highlighting his teaching. They turned him into a moral guide. Stop doing evil and learn to do good was how this poster summarized the entire message of the prodigal son. Now, it's unknown if this comes from a fundamentalist or modernist press, but that's precisely what makes it so interesting. The content gives us no clue because stop doing evil and learn to do good is a synopsis that could appear on any Protestant poster that featured a story from the Bible. For despite all their vitriol, when it came to their visual messages, fundamentalists and modernists both chose to communicate that morals, not miracles, were the key to salvation. Once again, we see the power of these posters to upend conventions and surprise our certainties. We have long assumed that fundamentalists and modernists were irreparably divided in China. But when it came to politics, social issues like class disparities, or preaching in pictures, they were in fact indistinguishable. The 1920s, 30s, and 40s were hugely important for the Roman Catholic Church in China. It was in this period that Catholics set out to indigenize the faith, that is, make it less European and more Chinese. Art was a major contributor in that effort. Celso Constantini, who had the rank of an archbishop, arrived in China in 1922 with an agenda. He was going to use Chinese artistry to express the Christian faith. And he managed to build a remarkable team of artists, most of whom converted to the Catholic faith while painting and teaching Christian artworks at Fudan University, the Catholic university in Beijing. These artists consciously worked to express Christianity in Chinese idioms. And I want to thank the artist and scholar He Qi, who contributed to this book, for helping me see how these Fudan artists used, for instance, traditional Chinese brush strokes and incorporated Chinese artistic devices. For instance, here you can see how the Catholic artist reproduced Ma's corner, a technique named after the ancient Chinese painter Ma Yuan, who liked to provide great detail in one corner of a painting and then allow the opposite corner to counterbalance it with an evocative emptiness. Or you can see how Catholic painters were taking popular deities like Guanyin and using her iconography to explain the Virgin Mary's compassion and tenderness. I'm gonna see if I can just move this. Oh, I can't. Sorry about it. I didn't realize I could do that earlier. Another way to indigenize the faith was to put it on Chinese soil. It did not always make great historical or geographic sense. For instance, here you have Joseph, Mary, and Jesus in a less than frantic escape to Egypt as they rode in a Chinese boat on what appears to be a Chinese lake, which we all assume will never get them to Egypt. But that was not the point. Jesus now belongs in China. And here you have Chinese shepherds visiting a very Chinese holy family, a family, in fact, that even keeps the Chinese rural custom of a new mother draping her head in a white cloth. Constantini rejoiced that as these works were painted and then printed onto posters, believing they inaugurated a new Chinese Catholic style. And others agreed. In fact, these posters became extremely popular, with special exhibits of them set up in places like Vienna, Paris, and Rome. But there are two underlying ironies in these posters. First, while it's true that they became enormously popular in the West, they were largely ignored or rejected in China. As the scholar Chu Xiaobai has noted, few Chinese Catholics ever bothered with these posters, but when they did, it was to complain. Chinese Christians were troubled by how Buddhist the posters appeared and asked why they were so blatantly unhistorical. Surprisingly, the attempt to sinicize Catholicism was not rejected by the West, but by the East. Second, as Stephanie Wong writes in her chapter on these posters, one cannot help but notice that the Catholic posters tried to express Chinese culture in very traditional terms. Mary, Joseph, and Jesus appear in traditional clothes. They uphold traditional values like filial piety, Jesus there serving his Father, and they champion Chinese traditional culture. The problem was, in the first half of the 20th century, that culture was under siege. Having bound feet, like the woman in the top right-hand corner, was quickly disappearing as a sign of beauty and becoming a mark of national disgrace. Or the Chinese robes that men are wearing, as you see in this Protestant poster's top corner, were becoming associated with dirt, filthiness, and backwardness, whereas the Western suit, which Protestants are promoting here, was a symbol of newness and modernity. In other words, the Catholic Church tried to adopt Chinese culture, but discovered that Chinese culture is anything but homogeneous. It ended up latching on to a version of Chinese life that was attractive to the Catholic Church, but was also disappearing even as these posters were coming off the presses. The takeaway? Catholic efforts at indigenization are praised, and understandably so, but these posters remind us that the process and results were not what anybody expected. They did not reinvigorate the faithful as much as they provided the Western Church an attractive, but perhaps illusory picture of Chinese Christianity. The late 19th and early 20th century marked the emergence of China's mass culture. Using new technologies, various print and visual materials could now be produced inexpensively and in massive quantities, and they began to flood the market. Now, sometimes missionaries are remembered for bringing the machinery that created this revolution. But even if they manage to sneak into a history book, which they seldom do, they are immediately dismissed as, quote, being irrelevant to later developments. I believe, however, that these posters demonstrate otherwise. China saw the birth of two forms of mass visual culture in the second quarter of the 20th century: propaganda posters and artistic advertisements. In fact, the two are really just one innovation. Images now had to persuade. The story usually goes like this. Communists first mastered the art of making ideology interesting. It didn't happen immediately. At first, communists carved wood blocks and stamped posters in black and white. Their prints conveyed stark emotions, but peasants found the two-color scheme boring and complained that the pictures were hard to understand. But in 1940, communists began to defer to more popular tastes and changed their posters from angry images like the one we just saw to more auspicious, colorful, and joyous prints like this. Here, the communists mimicked common Chinese New Year prints, even reproducing auspicious elements. The plum tree, as you see here, which blooms very early in spring, was popularly recognized as a symbol of renewal. The communists now offer the same, except under the party's red star, almost hidden there above the doorway. It was a breakthrough in political printmaking. People suddenly wanted these pictures because communists had figured out how to make ideology attractive. Meanwhile, the other great innovation was in advertisement art. Businesses, so the story goes, discovered how to make their products not only useful, but also their advertisements beautiful. Calendar posters, in particular, became the art of the masses. A tobacco company might stick a lovely outdoor landscape or a beautiful woman in the middle of a poster, and then print what looked like a silk border around it, the kind of border that would adorn any piece of fine Chinese art. Poems usually adorned the sides, and the bottom provided instructions on where to buy the product. These prints were so popular that companies managed to turn their advertisements into consumer products. People wanted to purchase these. Now, what's forgotten in these two stories is how Christian posters were an integral part of these visual revolutions. For example, Christian posters and advertisement posters appeared roughly at the same time. In fact, when China's very first 4-color offset lithography machine appeared in Shanghai in 1920, it was a Christian publisher who first used the advance in technology to make posters. And the posters Christians printed were often akin to calendar posters. Just notice the similarities here. Here you have a central landscape image that seems to tell some kind of story, and stories always made posters more popular. And it is surrounded by what seems to be a silk border. And it has couplets on the side. And at the bottom, you have a description of the product, the gospel, and then usually instructions on where to find it. Quote, please go to a church and hear the gospel and study the Bible. In so doing, Christians fused the two great visual revolutions of the time. Remember, communists managed to make ideology interesting. Businesses discovered how to sell advertisements. But before all that, Christians had already combined the two. They were doing the seemingly impossible. They were selling ideas. And when we understand that, we cannot think about China's modern visual culture the same way again. Chinese theology is an important topic and received great attention and careful study. However, the sources are all the same. The books written by Chinese theologians. And of course, that's an appropriate place to look. But let me just point out that the number of theological books printed were minuscule compared to the number of posters printed. The YMCA created 4,000 copies of Y.T. Wu's popular book, The Social Gospel, the largest print run they ran. In comparison, that same year, the Religious Tract Society just down the street in Shanghai produced 150,000 posters and an additional 1.5 million tract-sized versions of those posters for distribution. And the Religious Tract Society was but one of roughly 20 Christian publishing houses churning out posters year after year. So do you get it? There's no parity here. I mean, it's clear that poster production absolutely swamped book production. They were far and away the most public expression of Christian theology. And since they were consciously facing the public, posters were designed to woo viewers. So what theological messages did Chinese Christian artists believe would be compelling to their compatriots? What did they think would be meaningful to the masses? What could win China to Christ? Protestant posters were thoughtfully crafted to address the needs and desires of the average man or woman on the street, including how Christianity could improve labor conditions, get children access to modern education, provide protection from common diseases, and allow people to escape the terrors of hell and make it into heaven. However, the most common theme of Christian posters was undeniably the cross of Jesus Christ. Apparently, no other object, person, symbol, or text communicated the gospel more compellingly or clearly than the cross. Not even Jesus himself, who surprisingly is almost entirely absent from the posters. The cross became the highly condensed symbol that could speak to the desires of China's millions. Why was that? And what was it saying? First, we need to recognize the ways in which the cross came to substitute for Christ's presence. In this poster, for example, we see the cross illuminating the scene. One young man here at the bottom, with his back turned to the light, tries to read the Bible in his own shadow and just scratches his head in confusion. Meanwhile, the other man has turned toward the cross and he eagerly absorbs the word of God in the light. The allusions to the Bible are thick in this poster. It reminds those familiar with the Gospel of John that the light has come into the world, but the world has not understood it. John 1:5. However, for anyone who has come into the light, there is eternal life. John 3:18-21. And the title of the poster quotes Jesus, I am the light. John 8:12. But let's be honest, Jesus is not in the poster. In his place stands a red cross. It is the light of the world. Now, I'm going to pause for a moment because I suspect some of you are thinking, well, it's not surprising that Jesus is not on the cross. Protestants never put him on the cross because he is not dead but alive. That's true, but that's not my point. Chinese artists are painting Jesus' words from John chapter 8. Before he was crucified, I am the light. There is no reason not to paint Jesus himself here, but they skip him and put the cross in Christ's place. The cross apparently was believed to be a better ambassador of the gospel. Why is that? What is the cross's good news? I'm going to offer two reasons. There are more in the book, but I'm going to just lift out two today. First, I would say that the cross was compelling because it is strong. It offered stability in the midst of a chaotic world. I mean, just look at the size of this cross. It's bigger than the whole world. Its sheer size conveys something about strength. Or consider this cross. It's so massive, it can't be for crucifixion. I mean, these men's arms can't even stretch across that crossbar. I'm not even sure their arms can get past the clock in the center. This cross is not for crucifixion. It's just to impress on the imagination its sheer size. It fills the whole poster from top to bottom, from left to right. This cross is massive. It's solid. It's strong. Probably no poster captures that better than this one. I mean, just look at that monster. And the color's not brown, the color of wood, or even red, the color of blessing. It's blue and it's silver, reminiscent of those new powerful modern machines like the locomotive and the gunboat. This cross is unshakable. And to Chinese viewers in the first half of the 20th century, that meant a lot. In fact, it might have meant everything. Imagine this. In the first decade of large-scale Christian poster production, China experienced two extraordinary natural disasters. A famine in 1921 pushed 20 to 30 million people to the point of starvation. And then just 10 years later, a flood forced 52 million people to flee for their lives. In between those two catastrophic events, China endured more than a dozen civil wars, withered under crippling economic sanctions, was devastated by the Great Depression, and watched helplessly as Japan invaded Manchuria. And the following decade was arguably even worse, as the nationalist and communist armies turned regional conflicts into a national battle, and the invasion of Japan turned a national battle into a world war. China, in the heyday of Christian posters, was a country teetering on the brink of an abyss. No wonder viewers felt like they needed something strong to hold on to. And time and again, posters offered precisely that. The cross is a firm anchor, the one thing a person can count on in a tumultuous and dangerous world. If that isn't enough, then people might also embrace the cross because it was a gateway to an abundant life. You might think that since China was awash in tragedy and trauma, artists would have turned to the cross for comfort and solace, as others had done for centuries. This piece in Germany hung in a hospital reminding patients that Jesus is a man of sorrows and carries our infirmities and disease. But Chinese artists did not use the cross for that purpose. Instead, they used it to communicate blessing. In fact, that's what's written on top of this red cross, blessing, in case you might miss the point. The cross became a symbol for a new and better life. Part of this was communicated, of course, by drawing on popular imagery. The image on the left is from a Chinese newspaper and conveyed a common message to Chinese viewers. The nation is at a crossroads. Down one road, if China continues to buy foreign products, lies the death of the country. Down the other road, if people begin to buy their own Chinese national products, lies a path toward renewal and resurrection for the nation. Christian posters also used two roads in their imagery, and they were always divided by the cross. If someone ignored it, they were doomed to a hard life. Notice the curvy path, the uneven stones, even a poisonous viper there. But if you leave your sins at the cross, people are rewarded with a much easier life. I mean, check this out. That road is so smooth and straight, they don't even have to look down or where they're going. They can just read the Bible as they stroll toward heaven. Or you can see the promise of an easier life here. If you pass through the cross on the left, you are promised victory over sin. Or, as it says in some posters, you can leave your quote-unquote troubles behind. On the poster on the right, we get another image of an escape from misery. This woman is pulled down by grief, shame, sin we don't know, but if she can just pass the cross, she can move on to an abundant life. Significantly, these posters never ask someone to pick up their cross daily and follow Jesus. Because this cross is not a way to offer you comfort in your suffering, but an escape from it. Or to say it more positively, the cross in China promised viewers a better life and not merely a way to endure it. Because the cross became the central icon of Protestant Christianity, it especially received communist censure. In 1951, the last year Christian posters were produced, the cross was dramatically reduced in size and quietly drained of its power. The crosses that appeared no longer had any significant theological meaning. They just represented, as you see here, that this must be a Christian building. Or they mark these energetic young people as Christians, but the cross says little else. Under early communist control, the cross became little more than a generic reference to Christianity. That does not mean, however, that Chinese Protestants have forgotten the cross. In fact, it is still extraordinarily meaningful. It's why I would argue that despite all the various challenges Christians in China face today, what seems to mobilize them most is when a cross is removed from one of their churches. That, more than anything else, is perceived as a direct assault on their faith. In fact, in Huai'an, the church became so tired of the state removing their cross, the church putting it back, and then having it removed again, that they finally built the cross into the church. Try taking that down. Why go to such lengths? Because Chinese popular theology, born from sources like these posters, is not so much Christocentric as it is crucicentric. The cross has come to symbolize salvation. There you go. 5 quick stories about these posters and their potential to turn over tables, so to speak, when it comes to our conventions about Christianity in China, especially when we think about Christianity in politics, fundamentalism and modernism, Roman Catholicism, visual culture, and theology. But there are so many more stories. And that's my invitation to you. What do you see in these posters? So much is still left untouched, and I suspect even unnoticed in this collection of hundreds of posters. So I invite you to take a look. Go to the website, ccposters.com. Begin to immerse yourself in this new visual world and challenge yourself to look. Look at these extraordinary posters. There is so much more to find. This talk is really just the beginning. Thank you.